Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review, of course, from back in the day in Test Drive Unlimited 2. Yet again, it seems like kind of an appropriate time to cover some Test Drive Unlimited once again, of course with news of the third game coming out at some point in the future. And this vehicle is one which kind of catches your eye in terms of when you see it in the thumbnail or the title, but then if you played the game you'll probably have a flashback to actually using the car and not necessarily being all that impressed with it. Because the Hummer H3 is, let's be honest, a pretty slow car. In fact, it's one of the slowest cars in the game. I'm using car, of course, in the general sense, being actually an SUV. It's a B4 class vehicle, and it is basically the slowest off-roader in the game. But, even with that being said, its performance alone doesn't necessarily make it a good or a bad car. You can have an extremely quick car in a straight line, which nobody particularly likes, or you could have something that's slow, that's an absolute icon, and everybody loves it, and it's a classic. You know, Volkswagen Camper, for instance. However, the Hummer, well, it's a car that's easy to dislike. It's sort of like the Toyota Prius in terms of being the ultimate automotive jokes. It's just an easy target to pick on for comedy, for obvious reasons, and the Hummer H3 you could argue even more so than others because it's not even a red-blooded Hummer. It's a V6 instead of a V8, it's smaller, it's not as powerful. So yeah, it is a very easy target, and do I personally wish they had a H1 or a H2 instead? Yes, absolutely, because they would at the very least be more useful than this one is. However, you probably will end up using this SUV at some point in the game because it's so accessible. Now, of course, you've also got other options, my car, the Touareg V10, the Range Rover Sport as well. There are certainly some interesting rivals in the lower end SUV classes which aren't that expensive, but the Hummer is such an easy way to get into the SUV side of things that I think most of us have probably at least tried it in Test Drive 2, if not actually bought it and owned it. I certainly have in a couple of the playthroughs that I had. It's a cheap car. As I said, it's a 34,000 credit vehicle, which is pretty much nothing, or $34,000, whatever the currency is in the game. As far as the spec sheet, in some ways it's actually not bad. It's got 242 horsepower, which for the lowest SUV class isn't too bad. It is fairly heavy, of course, being a Hummer. 130 miles an hour flat out actually is not bad either. It's the 0 to 60 in particular, which kind of lets it down. 9.4 seconds to 60 simply isn't quick enough to rival really any of the other SUVs, and the only reason that this SUV will win an event is if you are using it as the player, because of course as the player you can overtake rivals, bash them off the road, or just be a better driver in general, especially at the start of the game, so you can certainly win with a slower vehicle. It's just that when you compare it head to head to pretty much any of the other SUVs, it's going to come up short, which is kind of unfortunate because Hummer has this reputation of being like the biggest, baddest SUV around, and the H3 just doesn't really live up to that. Now, I haven't had a huge amount of research into the background of the H3. I'm sure they were trying to go for a more attainable market, I guess, in real life, but it seems kind of weird to make this car at all. The newer Hummer, the forthcoming all-electric 1000 horsepower model, that makes all the sense in the world to me, because it gives the Hummer fans basically what they want, which is this massive, powerful beast of a car, but it also satiates those people who don't like Hummers because it gets rid of the reasons not to. For instance, the excessive fuel use, the ridiculous emissions, etc. The newer car doesn't have those direct issues. Of course, you can talk about electric manufacturing, etc. That's a different discussion for a different time, but this one just kind of fell between the cracks. It reminds me in some ways of what the Chevy SSR was in the first Test Drive game, you know, that weird kind of convertible pickup. I know that that car has its fans, certainly more fans than the Hummer H3, but it kind of reminds me of that. It's this weird vehicle on the market which I get why some people like it, but it doesn't really feel fully authentic. The Hummer definitely more so, but I put them on a similar playing field. Now, in terms of what this car can do in practice, as I said, it's a B4 vehicle. The performance is all down to you. You can win races with it for sure, but don't expect to be, worrying anything beyond the baseline of SUVs. I already touched on the power, 242. It's actually got a decent enough 241 pound-feet of torque as well, so it's at least on par with the power. And of course the weight is very, very high, 4,700 pounds. Not as much as other Hummers, but still very high nonetheless. And it's just, it's just kind of a ho-hum car. You know, there's only so much you can say about a Hummer H3, so I'm not going to extend this out unnecessarily into like a 10-minute review. But what I will say is that I believe the Hummer deserves a little bit more attention than it usually gets. I'm not going to try and turn around and convince you that this is some hidden gem that you've been thinking wrongly about this whole time. No, in fact, in a lot of ways, I agree with those sentiments. It's not an authentic Hummer, it kind of misses the point of what Hummers should be, but most of those things apply more to real life than in a game. Because in Test Drive Unlimited 1 and 2, there are some really slow cars, especially classics, which are really valuable, and you can still collect them and use them and even win races with them. So the fact that the car itself is slow actually isn't that much of a downside. It's more the opinion and the image of the car that tends to be what people joke about. It's actually a perfectly acceptable entry-level SUV. It gets you used to the SUV physics. Of course, SUVs weren't really in the first game, apart from stuff like the Chevy SSR. But in this game, the Hummer is a good off-roader, not that fast, but good enough. The handling in particular is actually really good. It does not have any kind of challenging factor to the handling at all, partially because you're not going that fast, but it's a very forgiving, very beginner-friendly car, and it's dirt cheap, so for me, the Hummer's one of those cars where I own it near to the start of the game. I might use it for 1 or 2 events, then as soon as I can I'll move on to like a Touareg or a Range Rover. Never use the Hummer again really for racing, but then I might actually come back to it just for the collection factor, because like it or not, it is pretty unique within the game. There were no Hummers in the first game as standard, no DLC Hummers, and the fact that Hummer's in there at all is, to me at least, kind of interesting. It's not gonna, blow the doors off of anything, and even if it were a H1 or a H2, it still wouldn't, because Hummers aren't designed for performance. It's just that those would have been undoubtedly, and I wouldn't even argue with this, a lot cooler than this car. So overall, that's it for my thoughts. Tell me down below though, what do you think of this car? Now, I fully think that if I drove a Hummer H3 in real life, I'm sure I could have a lot of great things to say about it, even on UK roads, but in the game, the glaring disadvantages of the car are just that much more apparent. Stuff like practicality and comfort and space, they mean nothing in a game. It's all about the power, the performance, etc., and it just doesn't have that. It's a very slow, very flashy looking car that just doesn't live up to the Hummer brand. But as I said, that's it for my thoughts. Tell me yours down below. Do you like the car? Do you dislike it? And until next time, I'll see you then. But of course, click here on screen to see my Test Drive Unlimited 1 and 2 footage, as well as some of the news that I've been covering about Test Drive Unlimited 3, aka TDU Solar Crown, as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.